All right, so first, Circle is housed in the College of Humanities at the University of Arizona. Circle is one of 16 language resource centers that are funded by the U.S. Department of Education under Title VI. At Circle, we research the teaching and learning of cultural awareness and literacy in second and additional languages. And we also provide educators with quality teaching resources, as well as professional learning opportunities like the one today. So if you would like to know a little bit more, you can go to the links that are put on this slide. So in February, Circle will be hosting its 9th International Intercultural Competence Conference. The focus this year is on intercultural learning, global citizenship, and peace building. And on the left side of this slide, you have our plenary speakers and the titles of their presentation. You can scan the QR code at the bottom of this slide in order to get some more details and access the registration link. So today is the first webinar in a series of 3 that we have entitled Rebooting Language Education. Please scan the QR code on this slide to get more information about this webinar and the others that are coming up. So before introducing our presenter, I would like to remind you of some ground rules for our webinar. So the first thing is that cameras and microphones are off. We'd like you to use the Q&A for questions that you have for the presenter about the presentations in this webinar. You can use the chat to introduce yourself, ask Circle technical questions, respond to the presenter, and you should be selecting Send to Everyone for all attendees so that everyone can see your comments. If you're interested in a certificate of attendance, request one in the poll near the end of this webinar. If you're also interested in a digital badge, Circle will be in touch with you. And finally, we will also email you when the webinar is available. So before introducing, I'd like to introduce our presenter today. The title of his webinar is Integrating Online Translators and Other AI Tools in Language Instruction. Dr. Errol O'Neill is an associate professor at the University of Memphis in the United States. He is supervisor of French graduate teaching assistants and course designer and developer of the 4-course online basic language sequence of French at University of Memphis Global, the University of Memphis's online degree program. He earned his PhD at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, in French SLATE, which stands for Second Language Acquisition and Teacher Education. And his research explores the intersection of technology and language learning, in particular student use of electronic tools, including online translators, online dictionaries, and more recently, AI chatbots, sorry. So he also has a forthcoming chapter that will be published in the Routledge Handbook of Research in World Language Instruction, which is scheduled to appear this fall. And in this chapter, he explores the topic of academic integrity and digital literacy among language learners. Thank you again, Errol, to present for us today. The floor is yours.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Thank you to Circle and to the University of Arizona for this opportunity. And thank you to everyone who is joining us from around the world. I was told there are about 800 people who registered for this webinar. It's a very hot topic, and we have a couple other sessions about this that are coming up later as well that I definitely will be attending as well. And so we'll go ahead and get started. And so I'll be talking about integrating online translators and other AI tools in language instruction. There's a QR code that has a copy of this presentation and also a document with a few other tools. But I know that the presentation is also being hosted by Circle. So a couple of different ways to get this. Okay, so we'll get started. In terms of what I'll be talking about today, going over online translators in the context of L2 instruction, artificial intelligence, chatbots, and second language instruction, and then comparing the two, talking a little bit about policies for these two types of tools, some assignments, what are some suggestions for what we can do with online translators and AI. And then at the end, we should have some time for some breakout rooms for co-creating a task or a policy that you would be able to use yourself with your own learners. And then there will be time for a Q&A at the end. So first of all, some definitions. Online translators are actually a type of AI, artificial intelligence, and they convert input from one language to another language. And I'll show you some examples of that in a minute. They often have additional features to assist users in fine-tuning the output, but the main feature is machine translation. Some examples are Google Translate, 𝘙𝑒𝑒𝑝𝑒𝐿, 𝑒vursO. So these have been with us for a while now, so you're very likely familiar with them. There are also AI chatbots. So for a given prompt that's given to the chatbot, it generates responses in a conversation style format based on predictions of what the best output would be. And it performs an almost limitless number of tasks, and that includes translating text between languages, or it can generate an entirely new text just based on input. So it goes one step further in terms of language instruction than online translators do, where someone can actually ask it to produce an entire text in the target language. And some examples of that are ChatGPT, Copilot is a recently renamed version of Bing AI, and then Bard. And there are also some specialized ones as well. And those are the logos for those. And first of all, I'd like to do a quick poll in terms of online translators. And you have the QR code here for that, or you can go to pollev.com/Errol M. 𝘠𝑒𝐸, and you have that on the slide there. So it's 2 questions about your current views and policies related to online translators. So that poll should be active, and I'll give you about a minute to answer that about what your thoughts are and what your policies are related to online translators. Okay, while those answers are still coming in, I'll go ahead and we'll start looking at what these answers are in terms of where you're coming from. So in terms of what your view is of online translators for your classes or institution, it looks like I was going to say majority, but plurality of people fully support students using online translators for classwork, at least sometimes. And it's about evenly split between tolerating students using OTs for classwork in some circumstances and people who are still on the fence. And it's only 8% so far that are saying that they're against using online translators in any circumstances. And I've been giving presentations on online translators for a while now, and this is definitely very different from even 5 or 6 years ago, for example. So there's been a growing acceptance. This is not a scientific poll, but a general idea that that confirms what's in the literature, that there's more and more acceptance for classes. And then in terms of explicit policies, it looks like the majority of people here explicitly allow online translators, at least in some cases, while some people do not allow online translators for classwork at all, and only a small percent don't have an explicit policy. And that may be partly because of the people who are likely attending this webinar. There's already an interest in online translators and artificial intelligence more generally. So it would make sense that the people who are attending are probably more in tune to having policies and using these with students. But it's impressive to know that there are this many people who are open to using online translators. And so talking about online translators in L2 instruction, the first online translator was Babelfish. So some of us who have been teaching for a while may remember that back in 1997. And then the following year, there were already reports in the literature of students using online translators. So they very quickly got wind that those existed. And they've evolved definitely over the years. Originally, it was rule-based machine translation with pairing the type of structure or word with another in the target language, to now there's neural machine translation, which is actually a type of AI where it predicts what the correct translation will be. And the output has gone from having one translation to having a choice of translations where you can click or consult other linguistic tools on the page or in the app to get a better translation. The concerns have also evolved regarding second language learning and online translators. At the beginning, the thought was that it might make writing incomprehensible, but now the thought is that online translators are too good, who is doing the work? And also there have been concerns about how to detect and prevent online translator usage in terms of academic honesty. And so now there's more and more a focus on how to foster learning through responsible use of online translators. And a lot of us, probably most of us are familiar already with Google Translate, but just a few quick examples here. So you type it the word in one box, and then you get a translation in the other box. It gives you, for in general, different definitions, different options that the user can consult. So if they're using it responsibly, you can actually get a lot of information and a lot of choices from the online translator. And this is other examples of that. It can do idiomatic expressions increasingly well. And you have some examples of that in French. I teach French, so most of my examples will be in French, but you see the English meaning there. You can also, both on the web and in the app, you can speak a sentence, and then it will give you a translation in the target language. And I have an example here of where you can have a conversation with Google Translate inside the app. And I'll go ahead and start playing this. And so this will give you an idea. You can imagine two students doing a role play in class, for example. So here we go.
Excuse me, sir. I've lost my dog. Have you seen a dog?
Excusez-moi, monsieur. J'ai perdu mon chien. Avez-vous vu un chien?
Je suis désolé, je n'ai pas vu de chien.
I'm sorry, I didn't see a dog.
Thank you. Do you know where the nearest police station is?
Merci. Savez-vous où se trouve le commissariat de police le plus proche?
Oui, il faut aller tout droit, et puis le commissariat sera sur votre droite.
Yes, you have to go straight ahead and then the police station will be on your right.
So this gives you an idea then of what it can do in terms of a conversation. If you were a tourist, for example, in a French-speaking country. So it's not just text-based translation. And there are many tools at students' disposition. And just going a little bit more into this, so online translators are widely used. 87.7% of face-to-face students in my study back in 2019, the article mentioned that they used online translators on graded homework, even though it was prohibited explicitly. And a large majority of online synchronous students in another study reported using online translators during class. Some positive aspects of using online translators, and since many of you do so with your students, you may be aware of some of these. Online translator students, students using online translators who had prior training in how to best use them were able to achieve higher composition scores compared to a control group that did not use an online translator. Other studies have found increased lexical and syntactic complexity and increased accuracy, improved vocabulary retention in a recent study as well. So that's good news. And in the study that I did, it was with a third and fourth semester second language learners of Spanish and French. There was a group trained to use Google Translate, one not trained to use Google Translate, and then there was a control group that didn't use Google Translate as well. There was a 20-minute self-guided online training in how to use Google Translate's interface, some hands-on translation examples to discover some strengths and weaknesses. And the results found that those who were trained in Google Translate scored higher on 2 written compositions than those who were not trained. Both of those groups scored higher than the control group. And it's important to note that just because higher writing scores were achieved does not mean the students necessarily learned more. But as I mentioned, there are recent studies that are coming out that do show that in post-test and delayed post-test, the students do as well, or actually do a little bit better than those who are not using the translator. So more results are coming in with that. Talking a little bit now about AI chatbots, there's another poll now, and I will launch this poll, which will take just a second. So this is going to be asking you the same questions, but this time looking at your views and policies related to AI, artificial intelligence. So that should be active now. And if you could just take a minute or two then, it's the same QR code as before, but it now should be launching with the new sets of questions. So looking at people's view of AI chatbots for classes, it's once again about half of people who are fully supportive of students using chatbots for classwork, at least in some circumstances. The next highest percentage so far is against using chatbots for classwork in any circumstances. So that's definitely a higher percentage than those who were saying that they're completely against online translators. And then it's about evenly split between those who tolerate chatbots for classwork in some circumstances, so not necessarily fully supporting it, and then other people who are still on the fence about it. So hopefully this will give you some food for thought. Talking a little bit now about AI chatbots and second language instruction. So the first AI chatbot, what's considered to be, is 𝘸𝑒𝐸. It basically was pre-programmed responses to scripted conversational terms. And there has been research done with 𝘸𝑒𝐸 and similar AI chatbots. And today, they are largely based on large language models, which are complex neural networks trained on billions of data points to generate responses based on predictions of best output. And so it's somewhat similar to online translators, except for this is for a wider variety of inputs and output. Some concerns for second language learning, who's doing the work. So given a prompt, chatbots can create entire compositions in the target language within seconds. And so very likely that's not what those of us who are language instructors, we're not wanting to read what the chatbot wrote in the target language. That's not the only use for chatbots, but that is one concern. Some solutions to this might be designing multi-step or iterative tasks, or training students in how to use AI for brainstorming or feedback, maybe having some of tasks prepared at home and then other parts in class. And we'll talk about more examples a little bit later on in the webinar. Some positive aspects of using AI chatbots for L2 writing are the timeliness of language support and practice, getting feedback right away. Improved performance on grammar assessments has been found in some studies. Better outlines for essay writing, so using it sort of to brainstorm and organize ideas as opposed to just writing out everything. Higher self-confidence in using the second language, and I thought that was especially interesting, that they're getting to practice with the chatbot and then gives them more confidence when they have other interactions. And with the MLA and CCCC, they came out with a position paper, and they stated the critical AI literacy is now a part of digital literacy. It's being used in other parts of society, in other parts of the economy. So it can be argued that it's important for students to be able to know how to use AI. Some use cases for students are explaining vocabulary and structures. It can be used as a virtual language tutor. Students can learn on their own, basically 24 hours a day. It can help with checking grammar, giving individualized feedback. some instructor use cases, instructors can use them as well. We can create lesson plans, write example text. We could say, if we want to focus on the future tense, for example, ask ChatGPT or another AI chatbot, write a text, a paragraph that focuses on specific future forms, for example. It can also be used for giving some initial feedback to students. And here's an example of one sample use. So a student obtaining feedback on a composition they wrote. So with prompts, with AI chatbot, it's good to give a context so that it knows what sort of response you're expecting. So saying, I am a French student and would like help with my composition. Here's what I wrote. Can you help me with what mistakes I made and explain why they're wrong? And so it has a text here in French that intentionally has some mistakes in it that would be typical for a beginning student. And then ChatGPT replies and goes step by step with some feedback and some corrections. So for example, les fleurs, ils sont tellement beaux. In French, fleur is the word for flower. It's a feminine noun. So instead of saying beau, it should say belle, for example. That's the feminine form of the adjective. So it gives the correction there. And you see a few other examples here. Sometimes it's a very straightforward explanation. Other times it goes a little bit more in depth. So this could be helpful for a student who writes in the target language to begin with to get some feedback from the chatbot to make some corrections and learn from them. And so here we go with an example of using ChatGPT as a conversation partner. So I'll play this here.
I am an English student and I want help speaking. Can you help me practice?
Of course, I'd be happy to help you practice your English speaking skills. What specific topics or areas of English would you like to work on?
Can we talk about food?
Absolutely. Let's talk about food. Is there a particular aspect of food you'd like to discuss, like your favorite cuisine, cooking tips, or any specific food-related vocabulary you want to practice?
I love to eat pizza.
Pizza is delicious. What do you like most about pizza? Is there a favorite topping or type of pizza you prefer?
I like meat on my pizza, but I don't remember the name of the type of meat I like.
No worries. There are several types of meat that people commonly enjoy on pizza. Some options include pepperoni, sausage, bacon, or even ham. Does any of these sound like the meat you like on your pizza, or is it something else?
Yes, pepperoni, that's it. It's round and red, right?
Yes, that's right. Pepperoni is a popular pizza topping. It's a type of cured and spicy sausage, typically round and red. It adds a flavorful kick to the pizza. Is there anything else you'd like to know about or discuss related to pizza or any other topic?
So as you can see, you're able to have an entire conversation with ChatGPT. I was pretending not to know the vocabulary, obviously related to pizzas, but and then afterwards you can see a text transcript of what you and the chatbot discussed orally, and it can be very useful. So it's a chance to have practice with the language when you're outside of the classroom, for example. So that's another use for chatbots that people may not necessarily be aware of. So comparing some of the features between online translators and AI chatbots. So there are some differences. Google Translate supports more languages than ChatGPT does. The content for Google Translate can only be written by the student or from other sources as well, but it can be translated into the L2 by Google Translate. But as I mentioned before, for a chatbot, the content can be written directly by the chatbot in the second language. For Google Translate, you can click on individual words to get other options, alternate translations. While you can't do that with ChatGPT, you have other options that I'll show in just a moment. You can get synonyms, brief definitions in an online translator. ChatGPT doesn't have that feature, but you can ask follow-up questions. And neither of them can be detected reliably either by humans or by AI tools. So that's has implications for academic honesty and policies trying to ban these tools if we can't reliably detect them. So talking about the reception, how they were received. So initially, with both online translators and AI chatbots, initially educators showed distrust towards them and asked their students not to use them. But with time, they're gradually starting to get used as pedagogical tools instead of being feared. And that's an important development. There hasn't been, at least that I found, there's a lot of research that's coming out on AI right now. So definitely I recommend reading as much as you can on this topic. But comparing online translator output from something like Google Translate to an AI chatbot, but there have been some initial impressions that have been perceived between the two types of resources if the goal is making a translation, but this can be taken with a grain of salt for now until more research is done into it. So using idioms with ChatGPT and Google Translate, they often gave almost identical results. So here's an example in Spanish. So Juan pateó el 𝘙𝑒𝑚. It's my third language, so I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that. So that's very literally kicking the bucket. But the author of the article says in some languages, the online translator had an edge in their testing, maybe because ChatGPT doesn't have the same access that Google Translate would have to millions upon millions of specifically translated text between languages. But ChatGPT can be asked to explain the meaning of idioms, and the user can ask follow-up questions. So, for example, asking it in French for Google Translate, Jean kicked the bucket. Again, it's a very literal translation, whereas with ChatGPT, it explains that it's an idiom and then gives an accurate possible translation for it. Jean a cassé sa pipe. Another example is with ghosted, a more recent term that's come up. And with Google Translate, it's not able to translate it. Even grammatically, it's not correct, much less in terms of vocabulary. Whereas with ChatGPT is able to explain what it means and then give a possible explanation of how you could express that in French. In French, they're also starting to use the verb ghoster from English, but this would be one way to explain it if you didn't know that. For isolated words that have just one meaning, Google Translate gives more information in general, as I showed earlier. With a ChatGPT, it will give one or two examples of translations, but without knowing context, it doesn't give more details than that. Here is another poll, and this is our last poll. So online translators, AI, and you. So there are two questions about your use of online translators or AI chatbots. So I will activate that question in just a second. And here we go. It should be live now. So if you can please answer about what you personally use online translators or AI chatbots for in terms of your professional work and in terms of personally. I think it's interesting to sort of flip things around and just not with our students, but then for ourselves as language instructors, what we use and don't use in terms of tools. So do you use online translators yourself? So a clear majority do use online translators, at least sometimes for work and in their personal lives as well. About 20% don't use it for work or personal life, where then 12% use it sometimes for work, 4% only in their personal life, and which makes sense that we're language professionals, I'm guessing for the most part in this webinar. So that shows that for work and also in our personal lives, we're open to using online translators. So let's look now for the AI chatbots. So a little less than the majority, so 44% use chatbots at least sometimes for work and in their personal lives. But a large percentage, about 30%, don't use chatbots for work or personal life. So that's interesting. So there are definitely more people using online translators than are using the AI chatbots, at least in our group. And there are some that use it for work, and then a smaller number that only use it in their personal lives. So a majority of people are using AI chatbots, but in somewhat smaller numbers in our group than are using online translators. Now let's talk about online translator policies, some samples and some suggestions related to those. So this was a survey that I did among instructors in US and Canadian universities. Online instructors largely had an explicit policy against using online translators on tests. Only about half of them had a policy against using them on other graded work, while about 30% had an explicit policy permitting online translators on at least some graded work, which is more along the lines of what we saw with some of the results for this group. And about 15% didn't have a stated policy either way for homework. So with online classes, it makes sense that there would be some more openness to allowing online translators for some tasks. So the question comes up, why not just ban online translators? As I mentioned before, there's no tool that reliably detects online translator usage. And there has been indication that instructors cannot reliably detect whether or not a student has used an online translator. In my study, for example, the rater who did the best only had about a 77% accuracy rate. So that would mean that out of 10 compositions that were given, 2 or 3 of them, they would guess incorrectly, and either the student would incorrectly receive a grade deduction or other sanctions, or it would be a student getting away, quote unquote, with using it. And then the lowest rater had about 30%. So that's less than half the time they were correct about whether or not an online translator was used. And one consideration would be that prohibiting or penalizing online translator use might not curb student use, but it may create a negative relationship between the instructor and the students. So they're not openly discussing what tools should be used, but instead they're doing it in secret. It's sort of like a cat and mouse game, and that's not necessarily a healthy relationship to have with students. Some examples of OT policies that instructors have used would be giving a list of tools that are allowed for use in the classroom, and this gives some examples here. Another option would be saying that you can use your book as your primary tool, you can use an online dictionary, and explain why it's good, in my opinion, to always explain why such and such tool should be used or should not be used, to give a motivation behind the policy. Some other examples are allowing Google Translate to be used as a tool, and it's not perfect. You have to proofread, but you can use it in your work. And another policy mentioned that online translators are a great tool if used intelligently. And that's sort of one area is encouraging responsible and intelligent use instead of just putting a text in the translator or the chatbot and then blindly copying what that is without any thought. So here's an example from a course we give at the University of Memphis for French. And it explicitly states online translators should not be used for graded work. You're not expected to have perfect French. Make sure you read the instructions, and it's not necessarily grading them on whether or not online translators are used because, as I mentioned before, they can't be reliably detected, but it's on whether or not it fulfills the requirements of the assignment. So if they're being asked to use the present tense or the past tense, is the student doing that, which they won't necessarily notice if they're just putting things in the translator and then pasting whatever comes out, for example. And so alternates are given in terms of using a dictionary, try to find a simpler word, and it gives examples. So letting students know that online translator use is not encouraged, and then giving some options to use instead. In terms of AI chatbot policies, there's definitely a need for some guidance using AI. And in this one study, 58% of L2 learners use ChatGPT at least weekly, of which about 15% use it daily. And this was back last year, so it's possible that that has even increased some. The Chronicle of Higher Education did some student surveys, and about half of students said that they use generative AI, and most of them said the instructor didn't provide a policy about AI use. And 60% said that there was no discussion of what is ethical or not ethical. So even if there was a policy, as I mentioned earlier, describing the reasoning behind it, why it is or isn't considered academic dishonesty, or what would constitute that. And then this was a presentation at IELTS that I attended with Francis and Whitaker. They surveyed 55 world language instructors and found that about half of them had a policy prohibiting AI chatbots. About 20% had a policy allowing limited chatbot use, and then about 27% had no policy either way. And again, this can be evolving given the fact that AI chatbots are very recently available to the wider public. And similar to online translators, there's no foolproof way to determine whether or not artificial intelligence was used. And with this one article, 29% of students and faculty correctly identified which of 4 compositions they were given were AI written. So if you think about it, so 1 out of the 4 compositions was written by AI, and only about 1 out of 4 people were right about it. So it's basically almost the same as chance. So there's no easy way of detecting it with human raters. And OpenAI had a detector on their website for a while, but then they pulled it. So the company that makes ChatGPT has said that their own detector was withdrawn because of the low rate of accuracy. So while there are some tools out there that purport to be able to detect AI, it's still not possible to do reliably. So one solution would be having an active discourse with students, talking about what these tools are, what is and what isn't appropriate for a language classroom. So the bans are probably unenforceable, and focuses that support students rather than punishing them may be more fruitful. And including broader language, covering online tools in general might be the best approach. So I talked a little while ago about some online translator policies, and in many cases, those can be adapted more widely to chatbots as well. And fostering a discussion and giving activities related to these specific tools can be helpful in getting yourself and your students on the same page in terms of using these tools appropriately. Here are some examples that I found of policies related to AI use. So this is from the University of Pittsburgh. So in many of these cases that I found, they're giving instructors options of what could be used for a policy. If you'd not like any generative AI to be used, if you'd like some generative AI to be used, and then allowing a broader use of generative AI. So the wording can go from talking about intellectual integrity towards we may use them in certain cases, and you'll be informed when and where you're able to use them, when and where you're not able to use them, and then more broadly allowing students to use them with some guidance though, and with citing your source, which is one concern, making sure that it's clear what came out of the chatbot and then what the student did. Another example would be a general framework allowing AI chatbot usage, that it must be appropriately acknowledged, and that if a student is presenting work as original, that it is original. If not, then it needs to be cited if you are using another source. This is from the University of Memphis English Department. So once again, dividing it into permission required, supplementary use, or guided use. And this gives some examples that instructors can use with their students, either talking about what the breach of policy, what that would entail, versus being able to use it to some extent to help supplement student use, versus the instructor working with the student in terms of what can be used for the language classroom. In this case, the English language classroom. And another example from Texas A&M University. The 3 courses of action identified below. So producing a syllabus statement, telling students what the requirements are, offering guidance, pursuing possibly a hybrid of the 2 previous options. So making it the responsibility of both instructors and students to make it clear what the expectations are and what tools are being used. And finally, considering different aspects when developing AI course policy. So what tools does it apply to? When does it apply? The processes and consequences, and the rationale and reasoning. As I mentioned before, I think that that's key so that students understand the reason they're being asked to do something or not do something with artificial intelligence. Looking now at some assignments, some tasks and approaches for online translators and artificial intelligence. And it's good to consider options for this. The different contexts are different. There are different preferences with instructors, different educational environments. And so there are options. And the good news is many of the strategies that are used with online translators can be used also with artificial intelligence. So one of the ones in the literature about online translation is survey and reflection. So students talking through and answering questions about the writing process when they're using an online translator. Guided use of machine translation, training students in how to use the online translator effectively, what it can and can't do well, and getting feedback from the instructor. There's also adapt and then discuss, assess, practice, and train. And that incorporates rubrics that are redesigned to account for online translation. So as I mentioned before, not necessarily penalizing someone for suspected online translation usage, but looking at specific elements that must be included in the student's work. And if they're able to use the tool to effectively do that, then that's great. If they're not able to, then they don't get the points for what they were not able to do. Another option is situate, investigate, and integrate. So including questions and homework or classwork that make allowances for online translator use, and not necessarily promoting it, but if students are using it, at least using it with reflecting on it, using it responsibly. So here are a few examples from that, and I'll show the details on the next slide here. So one step can be the prévisionnement. So before watching a video, for example, it's situating it. What have I just learned? And giving a list, what vocabulary from our chapter. So again, it's making it specific to the class. So it's not just using the online translator or a chatbot to give answers, but looking back to what has been covered in class. And then investigating in English to French. And so it's mentioning different options. So a reverse translation is given as one option, or checking the dictionary. And then it's talking about, and I like this, as maybe we'll be interested in looking outside the book, gasp for vocabulary words. Sometimes instructors tell students, you must use vocabulary that's in our textbook, and that's one way of trying to discourage them from using an online translator. But this is walking them through other steps where they can use other tools, but use them intelligently to help with their learning. And then for the post-viewing aspects of situate and integrate, so writing 5 pieces of advice in French using the subjunctives. So again, it's giving a specific requirement of what structure or words need to be included. And then having some reflection questions to help them write their response. So this is a way that students can complete the task. And if they're using another resource that helps them accomplish it, then that can be beneficial. And then this is a graphical description of that process that you have here. Another approach would be using training and responsible online translator use. And so in my study, I used a 5-step approach, introducing students to the tool, what is an online translator, demonstration of how the tool works, some hands-on testing so students can use it with some examples, reviewing with students the strengths and weaknesses of the tool, and then giving the policy. In this class, this is what you're expected to do or not do with the tool. And in the resources, along with my PowerPoint, there's a link to this sample activity in case you're interested. But it's basically saying, here are some advantages and disadvantages. Throughout, it's asking students to give answers, so they're not just passively reading it, or reading is an active activity, but they're paying more attention to what they're reading, and then giving answers as they go along. And then they use some hands-on examples where they're trying things out in the translator, they're putting the answer, then they're deciding, well, was this right? Did I use my own words to modify what came out of the online translator? And then also giving at the end the policy the students are expected to follow using the tool in the classroom. Another approach is a 20-minute training. This was in 𝘠𝑒𝑡𝘪𝑛𝘨 and Summers with 4 primary components: the difference between online dictionaries and online translators, which students often confuse, having some pre-editing, so avoiding idioms or other structures that could pose a problem for online translation, talking about the risk of online translation systems, including a discussion of academic honesty, privacy concerns, giving these large corporations our personal data, for example, and what are the strengths of online translation systems. And the survey results showed that online translator literacy was improved among students, so they knew better what an online translator was and what it could do. And they knew, for example, not to use online translators to search for isolated words, because generally the online translator needs bigger context in order to understand what the specific meaning is of that word, what is its grammatical function, to give a better translation. Increasing student linguistic awareness can be done through a group activity, which leads to limiting student translator use, so they can run provided sentences through a translator, identify any mistakes that they see in the output, and then they choose either an online translator output or they create their own answer. And that encourages students to think critically about how language works. And in the study that was conducted, over 75% of students picked their own translation. So they weren't just taking what came out of the translator, they reflected on it, and then they wrote their own translation that they preferred. And before the study, 100% of students reported using online translators during class, sometimes or often. And then after the study, it was only 50% who did. So it's not, it helped curb their uses. So maybe they're thinking more about whether or not they should be using it in certain contexts instead of just automatically going to an online translator, for example. Another approach is creating assignments that make online translator or AI usage less likely or less needed. One good way to approach this is grading based on meaningful conversations, so making it comprehensible input and comprehensible output, working on that as opposed to grading on grammatical accuracy. Students perceive the computer often to be more accurate in their expression than they are as a learner. But if they realize that the only thing they're being graded on isn't just whether the form is right or not, that can encourage them to reflect and use their own language as well. Planning different types of assignments is another option. A low-stakes assignment done at home where it's possible students are using the online translator or AI as well. And that could be worth fewer points. It could be practice with students. A more medium stakes example would be a live presentation where maybe the student is using an AI tool for preparation, but not during the delivery of the presentation, a Q&A afterwards. And then a higher stakes synchronous oral discussion where unless you had your phone with you, it would be pretty obvious you were doing it. You wouldn't be able to have the translation directly there. You would be talking one-on-one with the instructor, for example. And if that is done, that may be worth more points because it's showing that whether or not the student used an online translator prior to this task, are they able to accomplish the task and communicate effectively to complete that task? So now we have some time to do some breakout rooms. So that gives you a number of possibilities in terms of what are some policies, what are some possible tasks, some approaches for online translators. And as I mentioned, many of them can be adapted to artificial intelligence chatbots as well. So here's a Padlet, and you have the address that's there, the URL, and then you also have a QR code that's there. And so what I'll be asking you to do is to create a task or policy related to AI tools. It could be translators, it could be chatbots, or it can be inclusive of both. You have the QR code or the link that are there. And so in your groups, basically trying to come up with a consensus on a brief task or an idea that incorporates AI, either to promote responsible use or to discourage its use. And you don't have to agree 100% with other people in your breakout room about the approach, but it's just really to give you a chance to start developing ideas. And you can base it on something that we've talked about up until now, or something you've done with your own students. And I can start commenting on them. So we see here cooperative activities for students to discuss about the process itself and how using the translators have helped or not their learning process. I think that that's a great idea. So cooperative activities, the students can work with each other and talk about what comes out of the translator, try to work together to come up with what would be appropriate for what they're trying to accomplish with that task. We have another one here that we focus a lot on multiple intelligences theory in your training center. We have used online translators for quickly translating song lyrics that they're familiar with, and that can be interesting too, to compare the translations to find key words, discuss figurative and idiomatic language, and that can be an interesting linguistic discussion too, that having specific words that may literally be a correct translation, but in the context of the song, in terms of imagery, for example, in terms of rhyme, that there are other options that may be available than what artificial intelligence can give. Looking for another one here. So a task for students in a second semester class, having a chat with an AI on the topic that you're currently learning about. So for example, shopping. Evaluate the conversation. Did you understand the chatbot? Where did you not understand and why? How did the chatbot deal with a breakdown of understanding? And that's a good point too, that when I was simulating a learner, but there may be cases where the learner constructs their prompt in a way where the chatbot doesn't necessarily understand what the student is trying to say. So what did the chatbot do to try to understand the student? What did you do to try to get the chatbot to understand you? And basically what you can learn from that and what you can improve from there. So I can maybe read another one of these, and then we can go to answering some Q&A. So working cooperatively in groups and using AI to generate the vocab list for the lesson topic. So that's a good example as well. So like the example that I gave with the conversation about pizza, the ChatGPT gave several suggestions of ingredients of toppings that can be used on a pizza. So that could be used for vocabulary, for example, on other topics as well. And here's someone that has used ChatGPT with their students. ChatGPT was very helpful for my EFL students. I asked them to use it as a native speaker consultant. They would ask, for example, how to say I was very happy in a more figurative and engaging way. And that's a great idea. So the student can give their ideas and so that way they're coming up with the ideas of the content of what they would like to express, but then the chatbot could give them ideas of how to improve it, how to expand it. And as I mentioned, there has been some research that's been done that indicates that students can learn and retain vocabulary more using a chatbot. So that would be another great use for chatbots. And thank you very much for doing that. And then one last quick thing before going to the Q&A. So basically, it doesn't need to be an all or nothing approach. So it's good to become familiar with online translators if that's the tool. That can be to promote language proficiency and ethical use using 21st century tech, focus on grading successful meaningful communication, emphasizing that over accuracy, which may drive students to using a tool that they think will be more accurate than them. And then just to conclude, then there's no denying that the increased student-computer interface will remain as a byproduct of the pandemic. And basically, there's a triangle relationship between the instructor, the student, and the computer, which cannot be undone, nor should it be. And I think that that may be a good way to view these tools are something that are with us, and it's good to try to use them in a beneficial way with our students. And you have here ways to get in touch with me in terms of email, Twitter, or Facebook. You can get the copy of the presentation. I have a study that's coming up, so if you're interested in information about that, you can contact me as well. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And now's a good time for questions and answers.
All right. Well, thank you so much for this really wonderful and very detailed presentation about what to do with these tools, what these tools are about, as well as some examples of policies. So we have quite a few questions. Some are related to policies and training students with these tools. Others are more specifically addressing the tools themselves and what they can do. So I'm going to try to sort these and see what we can do. I think in terms of policies, you've already kind of laid out that quite well in the presentation, but it might be worthwhile just to get back to this. So so somebody was interested, and I think you you had a slide on this, but someone was interested about your own personal course policies on academic integrity and the use of OTs and AI in your courses.
That's a great question. And with our department, my department of world languages and literatures, we've had a number of discussions about online translators, as you might expect. Generally, we tell students that they aren't allowed to use online translators, which is something that we're constantly looking into. But in practice, there are those of us in some circumstances where we make clear guidelines, like the one that I showed earlier, where it's saying that instead of using online translators, please use this instead. So it's something where I'm not specifically going out and trying to catch students using online translation, but it's built into the rubrics. So basically whether or not the students are using the content and the structures that are requested. So in an ideal world, I would like to be able to tell students that, yes, you can definitely use online translators in such and such circumstance, but I happen to be in a situation where I encourage them to use other tools as well. And I'm honest with students, and I tell them that I won't necessarily be able to tell whether or not you've used an online translator, but these tools and these other options can help you as you're starting to learn the language.
Great, thank you. You presented quite a bit of research during the presentation. Someone was wondering if there is anything out there focusing on AI and L2 instruction in less commonly taught languages.
That's an excellent question. And I know that I have read an article or two that were discussing that. And one thing that I can do is I can look, and if there are other questions where I don't necessarily have an answer, in that QR code, there's also a document that has some useful links. So I have seen that discussed, but I can't think offhand of the specific articles. But yes, so that is a very important point. And there's so much that can be discussed about this, but this is an important point, that these online AI chatbots have been trained largely on English, and then also European languages after that to a large extent. So that means that there are some biases in terms of cultural production, if you ask it questions to the chatbot, then there may be some biases that are in there which are important to watch out for. And the same thing with the languages. My understanding is that the output of AI chatbots is not as strong with people who are not native speakers of English or of other languages that the AI has been trained on. So there are resources out there that discuss that. And if I find that, I can put that in with those documents.
We actually have one of our attendees who posted an article that she recently wrote with respect to Arabic. So, and it's in FLT Mag. I want to switch, you kind of alluded to this. So there were several questions in relation to the tool that you used for that conversation about the pizza or the food and so on. Several attendees were wondering if this was part of the free version of ChatGPT or something else. And then there was also an interesting question here where somebody is asking, my understanding is that ChatGPT has been trained on written language. Is this true? And yet we're using these tools to also assist us in spoken language interactions. How do you address this chasm between written and spoken language forms with your students?
Yes, those are great questions. And yes, my understanding is I have the paid version of ChatGPT because I do research on it. But my understanding is in either late November or early December, that feature to have the conversation with the chatbot became available to the general public. If that is not the case, there are other tools that do that, but I'm fairly, I believe that that's the case, and I used the chat GPT, I used GPT 3.5 for that reason. So with the paid version, there's GPT-4, which is a more advanced version of the engine, and then there's 3.5, which is the one that's generally available for free. So in my example, I used the 3.5 one, but yes, and then the question about what training data, and yes, that's a very good point. The data that it's been trained on based on what has been released to the public, my understanding is also that it's trained on written data, that the web was scoured basically to get as much data as possible in terms of text to train the neural networks on. And so that does have interesting implications in terms of using it for spoken language. At the same time, they do have I find it very interesting that they have very natural sounding synthetic voices. The one for French or English was the best, but I know that they have some for French and Spanish. Again, in terms of less commonly taught languages that may not be as available, but it emulates the sort of intonation and pronunciation that you may get from a native speaker. So in terms of the content and in terms of the spoken voice, although they're not, it's not actual speakers, it's not data from spoken language, in the data that it's been trained on, there are examples of transcripts of spoken language, for example.
All right. Since we're
That's a great question.
in the same line of training, some people were interested about, how do you train students to use these tools effectively? Also, somebody was interested, maybe it's something that you mentioned during your presentation, was interested in hearing more about the self-guided training for Google Translate.
Yes, so in terms of the training, there are a number of possibilities that you could do. The one that I mentioned that I did for my study, it basically is going through step by step. And I will see if I can quickly pull that up as I'm talking. But yeah, so the idea basically in a number of cases is introducing students to the tool what are some strengths and weaknesses, and then having them do some sort of task with that tool. So in my case, with my study, I had them do some text that they were inputting, because with the study, what they were going to be doing was writing compositions in the target language, in either French or Spanish later. But if it's a cultural discussion, or if it's some other type of task that the instructor would be using, there are other types of training that could be given for AI or for the online translator. So I'm trying to find this as I talk, but so maybe, but yes, so, and there are some of the examples I gave in the presentation, and I can pull up mine maybe as I'm answering another question, if that's okay.
Yeah, somebody has a question. I think it's policy-ish in some ways, or concerns about the use of these tools. So Katya is asking, do you have any security or privacy concerns related to the use of AI? How about students who prefer not to use AI, since for signing up, they would need to share their phone number with it?
Right, those are great questions, and I know that that's something that a number of instructors are concerned about. I think that that's why, in terms of my personal thoughts on it, I would not necessarily require that AI be used in a classroom. That's something that students could decide whether or not they would choose to use it. If that is the case, then they would be able to use it for compositions, for example, or for writing outlines, for getting help in terms of their essays if they choose to, or if not, there would be other resources that are available to them. It's true, though, that if there were a training session and students would be asked to use the online translator or AI in order to complete that training, then that's true that that would be something to consider, what the implications for that would be, and maybe allowing students to opt out, for example. But it's something, in my experience, and there are different concerns in different places. In the US, not very many students tend to ask about that aspect of things, whereas I know in other places that is more of a concern. So there's no simple answer, basically, but I guess it would depend on whether or not you're requiring the AI tool to be used, or whether or not it's just one of many options for students.
So still in the area of policy, what are your recommendations for teaching AI literacy on campuses that have campus-wide policies against AI? Most of the students I work with, and I'm a former classroom teacher that's now a tutor, all the schools, universities I work with have updated their plagiarism policies this year to state that any use of AI constitutes plagiarism.
Yes, and that's a very good question, a very difficult question. So as I mentioned, at my own institution, in my own department, we do not allow students to use online translation, while at the same time, we are aware that students are using online translation. And I don't mean this as a critique of my institution or department. I know that there are a number of places that are in that situation. I would say trying to open a dialogue with colleagues is the best thing to do. And I know that I have colleagues in my department that originally were very much against the use of online translation, but who now are more open to it, who for example, if there's a case where online translation use is suspected, that that's not something that they actively go after to try to catch students doing it, for example. But it's a conundrum, because you don't want to have different policies for different classes, but there are still a number of people in the audience, the participants for today's webinar. The majority of them are using OT or are fine with students using online translators, but that's not necessarily the case more largely at all institutions. So I would just say trying to talk with colleagues, sharing information. I've mentioned some of my own information from studies in terms of how many students are using it. Just banning it is not stopping them from using it, for example, and just keeping a conversation going. And then I did find my training that I could share quickly, if that's okay.
Sure. Somebody was actually asking about this. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So basically, and this is one of many ways that you could do it. So basically having an intro, and this is in a Google, I should mention, a Google form. And so this is what it looks like as instructors for the Google form. But you would be able to create your own copy of this. So the link that's in the document that is linked to in the QR code has a link to it, so that when you click on it, it makes a copy of this if you'd like to edit your own version of it. But yeah, so introduction to the tool, they put their name, whether or not their teacher has assigned training to me. What is Google Translate? What does it do or not do? Some advantages, and these are based on what's been found in the literature. And then which of these are important to you? So there's no correct or incorrect answer, but it's giving them the option to the opportunity to reflect on online translators. Some disadvantages of them, summing it up, which of these is true, and then it goes through basically how to use Google Translate. So in many cases, they will already know, but some students may not know, and it walks them through with some screenshots. And then it's that they answers that they would copy this, for example, what time is it? Or they would type it into the translator. Then they put what the translator put there, and then they have to reflect on it and think, well, how do you think the translator did? Is it correct? Could it be correct? It's only partially correct. And doing a number of those examples, and then going one by one through, well, yes, this is why this is correct, or why it could be correct, depending on the circumstance and such. Then looking at some of the more detailed features that I mentioned during the webinar. And then at the end, they write an original sentence on their own, and then they decide what they think the translator did, or did they have to edit it. And this could be done also with AI, this sort of approach too. This happens to be with Google Translate, but it can be for other electronic tools too. So this is one option.
Yeah, I have a question here about using AI tools with beginning learners. Someone is saying, normally AI responses are too advanced in word use and sentence structures. What are your strategies for using AI for beginning level foreign language learners?
That's a great question. And I can show quickly, I believe this is being shared here. Unfortunately, that I may not be logged in here, but I can just say it. Basically, it's possible to tell the chatbot, so ChatGPT, for example, I am a beginning French student, write a composition making the same kind of mistakes that a first semester student would make. And it does it. It makes the sorts of mistakes in terms of word languages that have gender agreement, verb conjugations and such. So it's possible if you're looking at, well, how do I know if students are using it? You can't necessarily tell because of that, because the chatbot can use it itself. In terms of helping them use it themselves instead of trying to get around using their own work, if you can do with the prompt, you can do the same thing. You can tell it, I'm a beginning English speaker, please help me. And then it will give responses that are, in many cases, language appropriate. In my testing of it, not for a study, but just for background information, sometimes it does a good job at that using more simplified vocabulary. Other times you have to remind it that, well, this needs to be a little simpler or a little shorter. So it is possible to tell ChatGPT to help the learner at that specific level. And it is familiar both with ACTFL as well as the European framework for language levels. So if you tell it, well, my students are such and such level, or I as a student am such and such level, it can actually help.
Here, I mean, kind of related in some ways. Someone was asking, do you have your students correct their compositions using ChatGPT 3.5? Would it be a good exercise to have them write their composition in class first by hand and then correct them so that they learn through their mistakes?
That would be one way to go about it. With my own students, I have not yet used ChatGPT. It's something that I would like to do. And I'm planning research where students will be able to use it for the study. But from what I've read in terms of literature and just from other colleagues who are working on this, that you can either do that, have them write it on paper first, and then afterwards, or on the computer first without access to the chatbot, and then get feedback on it. Or you could use it as a partner at the beginning of the process to come up with ideas for what to write. So not telling ChatGPT, for example, write me a composition about Spanish language cinema, for example. But instead getting some ideas, maybe the student would write their own outline and then work from there, or ask the chatbot to give me some ideas of topics that I could write on. So they're really, just because AI chatbots can do so much, there are a number of ways it could be approached. And yes, either having them not use the chatbot and then getting feedback afterwards from it is one approach. Another approach would be have them using it along the process and then having that final step, whether it's a presentation or a test, where they're not able to use it, then to check for did they actually learn the material or acquire the language that was targeted.
And another question that I find quite interesting too, is this more so the use of online translators, ChatGPT and other tools like this? Is this more about using these tools because they have inherent pedagogical value that can be approximated, provided by other means? Or is it because they exist and will be used and we therefore need to incorporate them in some capacity?
That's another excellent question. And I think there's a little bit of both. So the argument that I tend to use is the one from a practical standpoint that we're not realistically going to be able to prevent students from using generative AI, from using online translators. They already are, we're not able to catch them. And there are ways that we're able to get them to use them more intelligently. But there are also practical uses that cannot be done just without it. And one of those is being able to have assistance 24/7, for example. If there's a student who really does want to practice their spoken target language, for example, that's something in terms of writing or speaking. There are a variety of tools that are out there where they can practice. Duolingo, for example, recently came out where it's a paid feature, but you can have role plays with them. So yes, basically, it's something I would say I feel it's a necessity because it's out there and there's no way to reliably prevent it unless we just shut everything down and they do everything with no access to technology. But there are actually some uses, and like I mentioned, there are articles that I found that it actually can improve acquisition, and it also increases motivation in students to use AI chatbots.
Thank you. So we are at the end of our webinar session. One question that was asked, and I don't know if it's provided at the end of your slide deck. There were several people were asking whether you have a list of the references that were mentioned during the webinar.
Yes, so references, I did not put them up yet, but they will be up later today. But
Okay.
yes, I can mention those. Currently, the list that's on there are a number of URLs that can be useful. But in terms of the specific references, I will put that up there.
So I don't want to take more of your time or our audience time. There are still many questions in the Q&A, which actually demonstrates the interest that people have in this particular topic. Dr. O'Neill has provided kindly his email address and other forms of contacting him. So I invite you to contact him if you have some pressing questions that we were not able to answer during this 90-minute webinar. Thank you so much for coming today, and we hope to see you for the next 2 webinars, which are part of this series.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.